You'll do exactly as I say, or your daughter dies with the rest of them." The words drifted through the crack in the chapel door like smoke under a locked room, and Seraphine felt her own blood turn to river ice. She had come to the Eastern Chapel only to bring her mother a shawl against the cold, a small kindness, a nothing errand. Now she stood frozen on the threshold with her fingers still wrapped around the wool, and the world she had trusted her whole life split cleanly down the middle. That voice belonged to Isolde, the Alpha King's mistress, and the woman she was threatening, the woman standing meekly with her hands folded, was Maren, her mother. Something snapped inside Seraphine's chest, a bond she had never questioned, the invisible cord that ties a child to the certainty that her mother is hers alone and good. It broke with a sound only she could hear, a soft internal crack like a frozen branch, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She pressed her back to the stone wall of the corridor. Cold seeped through her dress and into her spine. She listened. "Lower your voice," Maren whispered, and it was not the whisper of a frightened woman. It was the whisper of a conspirator. "She could be anywhere. She's always been quick." "Then be quicker," Isolde said. "The council votes at the next full moon. Caelthorn trusts you. He has always trusted you, the loyal healer, the dead soldier's widow. Put the tincture in his cup 3 nights running, and by the 4th his mind will be soft as wax. He'll sign the marriage decree. He'll name me queen. And when he does, the old bloodlines fall, and your girl becomes a threat we no longer tolerate. And in return you live. In return you keep the estate at Duskwater and the title I promised. Your daughter is the price of your comfort, Maren. She always was. You knew that when you agreed." Seraphine's mouth filled with the taste of copper. She had bitten the inside of her cheek without knowing it. She stared at the flickering torchlight spilling through the gap, at the shadow of her mother's bowed head, and she understood with a clarity that scalded her that everything she had believed about her family, her place, her safety, had been a story told to keep her still. She did not scream. That was the first choice she made, standing there with a shawl going useless in her hands. She did not throw the door open and demand answers. Screaming was what they would expect, and screaming would only tell them exactly how much she knew. Instead, she breathed. Once. Twice. She let the cold clarity spread from her chest into her limbs until her shaking stopped and something harder took its place. She set the shawl down on the floor outside the chapel, folded neatly, as if it had been dropped by a careless servant. Then she walked away, unhurried, her soft leather shoes making no sound on the flagstones, past the tapestries of the Ashenmoor kings, past the mounted antlers and the smoking sconces, out into the courtyard where the moon hung fat and white over the mountains. She had grown up in the shadow of Caelthorn's palace. Her father had died in the border wars when she was 6, and her mother had brought her here to serve as the royal healer. And Seraphine had spent 17 years believing she was safe because she was useful and quiet and loved. She had studied the herb gardens and the old medicine texts. She had learned which roots stopped bleeding and which ones started dreams. She had made herself indispensable in the small ways that women without power learn to make themselves indispensable. And all that time, her own mother had been building a gallows with Seraphine's name carved into the beam. The night air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the faint mineral tang of the hot springs beneath the palace. She walked to the low wall at the edge of the courtyard and gripped the cold stone and looked out at the sleeping valley of Ashenmoor, the terraced farm silver in the moonlight, the river a black ribbon threading through it all. Somewhere down there was a life that did not know her. Somewhere out beyond the passes were cities she had never seen, packs she had never met, roads that did not lead back to this place. She thought about the tincture. She knew exactly which one Isolde meant. Wolfsbane distilled through moonflower, a thing her mother kept locked in a cedar box, a thing that could soften a strong man's will, and, in the wrong dose, stop his heart. She thought about Caelthorn, the Alpha King, broad and grave and grey at the temples, who had once lifted her onto his shoulders when she was small and let her touch the crown. She did not love him the way a subject is supposed to love a king, but she did not want to watch him poisoned by her own blood, and she did not want to die. The certainty of that settled into her like a stone dropped into still water. They had already decided her death. They had spoken of it the way one speaks of clearing a field. The price of your comfort, as if she were a debt to be settled. She looked down at her hands, the healer's hands her mother had trained, and she made herself a promise in the language of the resolve that had replaced her grief. They think I am the weakest piece on the board, she thought. They think I will stay still because I have always stayed still. Let them think it. Let them plan their poison and count their moons. I will be gone before they reach for the cup, and one day I will come back, not as the price of anyone's comfort, but as the reckoning they never saw drawing near. Then she turned from the wall and went, quietly, to prepare. Seraphine did not sleep that night, but she did not pace either. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her small room beneath the eaves, and she made a list in her mind, cold and orderly, the way she made a list of symptoms before a diagnosis. She had until the next full moon. That was the deadline Isolde had named, the night of the council vote, the night the tincture was meant to have already begun its work. That gave her perhaps 3 weeks. 3 weeks to disappear so thoroughly that no one could follow, and to disappear in a way that did not warn her mother she had been overheard. The second was harder than the first. If she vanished suddenly, Maren would know. Maren would know that her daughter had learned the truth, and Isolde would send riders after her, because a girl who knew of the plot to poison the king was no longer merely inconvenient. She was a witness who could hang them both. So Seraphine could not run. She had to be seen to leave for an ordinary reason, or better still, she had to seem not to leave at all. She thought of Bramwell. The old man had been the palace steward's assistant for 40 years, and then when his knees gave out, he had been quietly shuffled down to keep the record books in the archive that no one visited. He was the only person in the palace who had ever treated Seraphine as if her thoughts were worth hearing. When she was 12, he had taught her to read the old ledgers, the trade contracts and the bloodline registries, and the tax rolls because, he said, a person who understands where the money moves understands where the power sleeps. She had thought it a kindly old man's hobby. Now she understood it might be the thing that saved her life. At the grey edge of dawn she went to him. The archive was a long, low room in the oldest part of the palace, cold even in summer, smelling of dust and tallow and cracked leather. Bramwell was already awake, as the old often are, hunched over a ledger with a candle guttering beside him. He looked up when she entered, and his face changed at once. He had a diagnostician's eye of his own, honed on people rather than plants. "Child," he said, "who died?" "No one," she said. "Not yet." And then, because she trusted him and because she had no time to be careful, she told him. She told him what she had heard through the chapel door, the tincture and the council vote, and the price of her mother's comfort. She watched his face the whole time, ready to see disbelief or dismissal. She saw neither. She saw an old man who had spent 40 years watching the powerful and was no longer surprised by anything they did. "So," he said at last, very quietly, "it's Isolde who's the spider, and your mother the fly, caught so long ago she's forgotten she ever had wings. And they mean to have the throne and to have your throat as the toll." He closed the ledger. "You cannot stay. I know. But if I run, they'll follow. Then don't run like a hunted thing. Run like a planned thing." He rose, wincing, and went to a shelf where the estate correspondence was kept. "There is a place. Every year the Northern Trade Guilds send to the palace for a healer to winter in the mountain towns. The passes are bad, and the physicians won't go. It is a miserable, unglamorous post, and no one wants it. And every year I write the letter declining on the king's behalf. This year I will write that the king graciously sends his junior healer, Seraphine, to serve the guild towns of the Varren range. It is real. It is documented. It is boring. Your mother will believe it because it is exactly the sort of dutiful, forgettable errand she has taught the world to hand you." Seraphine felt something loosen in her chest, the first easing since the chapel. "And once I'm in the north." "Once you're in the north, you are 300 miles from her poison and her spider, past 2 mountain ranges and a border, in a country where the name Ashenmoor means very little. The guild towns are free towns, child. No alpha rules them. They answer to no king. A woman there is measured by what she can do, not by whose blood she carries or whose price she is." He smiled, a dry crackle of a smile. "You will do very well there, I think." She helped him draft the letter that morning, in his careful hand, and she watched him seal it with the steward's authority he still technically held. It felt like watching a door open in a wall she had thought was solid stone. But there was one more thing, and it was the hardest, and she made herself speak it. "There's the matter of the poison itself," she said. "If I simply leave, they'll find another way, another vessel. The king will still drink it. I won't be here to stop it." Bramwell looked at her a long moment. "You could warn him. Go to Caelthorne now. Tell him what you heard." "And it would be my word, the junior healer, the daughter of the loyal widow, against the king's own trusted healer and the woman who shares his bed. Who do you think he believes? And the moment I accuse them, I am dead by nightfall, and no wiser for it." She shook her head. "No, I can't stop it with words. Not now. Not as I am. But I can leave something behind. Evidence. Proof they can't wave away, held by a hand they can't reach." She thought of the cedar box, the locked box where her mother kept the wolfsbane tincture. She had a key to it, because her mother had trusted her with the medicines, because it had never once occurred to Maren that her quiet, dutiful daughter would ever be anything but a tool. That trust, Seraphine realized, was the one weapon she truly owned. She would use it precisely once, and she would make it count. Over the following days, she moved through the palace exactly as she always had, gentle and unremarkable, changing dressings and brewing teas, and no one saw the ledger she was keeping behind her eyes. She wrote down every conversation she could overhear. She noted the days Isolde visited her mother's rooms, and the hours the mistress spent alone with the king. And on the third night before she was to leave for the north, when the tincture bottle sat full and ready in the cedar box, she did the thing she had planned. She did not destroy it. She took a careful measure of it into a small vial of her own, sealed with wax, and she wrote out in her own hand a full account of what it was, what it did, who had made it, and what it was intended for. She wrapped the vial and the account in oilcloth, and she gave the whole package to Bramwell. "If I die on the road," she said, "or if I simply vanish, you take this to the War Marshal Corvain, not to the king, to the Marshal, because the Marshal answers to the crown, but not to Isolde. You understand? Not the king, the Marshal." "I understand," the old man said, and he took the package as if it were a living thing. It was the first move in a game she did not yet know how to win. But it was a move. And for the first time since the chapel, Seraphine slept. She left on a grey morning with the passes still clear, riding a plain brown mare from the palace stables with a healer's satchel and a change of clothes, and Bramwell's letter of commission folded against her heart. Her mother came to see her off, and this was the part Seraphine had dreaded most, because she did not know whether she would be able to look at Maren's face and keep her own face still. But she managed it. She had learned stillness at that woman's knee, after all. "You'll write," Maren said, tucking a strand of hair behind Seraphine's ear with a mother's easy tenderness. And the tenderness was the worst part, because it was real, or seemed real, and Seraphine understood then that a person could love you and sell you in the same breath and see no contradiction in it. "The mountain post is only for the winter. You'll be home by spring." "By spring," Seraphine agreed, and she let her mother embrace her, and she did not stiffen, and she did not weep. And when Maren stepped back, Seraphine looked at her one last time and thought, "You will never touch me again," and smiled a soft, dutiful daughter's smile. Then she turned the mare's head toward the northern gate, and rode out of the only home she had ever known without looking back, because she had already grieved it, all of it, in a single night, and there was nothing left in that palace that belonged to her. The road north was long, and it broke her down and it built her back up. The first week she wept in the saddle where no one could see, ugly private weeping for the mother she had lost while that mother still lived, and for the girl she had been, who had believed she was safe. By the second week the weeping stopped. The mountains had a way of shrinking grief to its proper size. She crossed the first range in a cold rain, and slept in a shepherd's hut, and shared her bread with a mangy dog. And somewhere in that crossing, the last of the palace fell away from her like a heavy cloak she had not known she was wearing. She reached the guild towns of the Varan range as the first snows came. They were nothing like Ashenmoor. There were no palaces, no thrones, no alphas draped in ceremony. The towns clung to the mountain sides in tiers of timber and stone, roofs steep against the snow, and they were run by councils of merchants and craftsmen, and, to Seraphine's astonishment, women who owned their own trade and answered to no man. The largest of them was called Holdkeep, a mining and trade town of some 8,000 souls where the roads from four passes met, and it was here the guild had asked for a winter healer, and it was here Seraphine meant to disappear, and, without yet knowing it, to be reborn. She had expected to be tolerated. She was, instead, needed. The town's only physician was an ancient, gout-ridden man named Ferrand, who had not climbed to the upper tiers in a decade, and who greeted her arrival with the naked relief of a drowning man handed a rope. Within a week, she had seen more patients than she had in a season at the palace, miners with crush injuries, and smiths with burns, and children with the coughing sickness that swept the high towns every winter. She worked until her hands cramped, and her eyes blurred, and she discovered something that surprised her. She was good. Not merely competent. Not merely dutiful. Good. Away from the palace, where her worth had been measured by her usefulness to people who despised her, her skill was suddenly her own. It belonged to no one but her, and she poured it out, and the town drank it in, and for the first time in her life, gave her something back. They gave her respect. A miner she had pulled back from a fever brought her a sack of the good coal in thanks. A weaver whose daughter she had saved wove her a coat against the mountain cold, dyed deep forest green, and Seraphine wore it every day and felt herself become someone new inside it. The Guild Council, hearing of her work, extended her commission past the winter, and then, in the spring, offered to make it permanent, with a stipend and a house of her own on the 3rd tier, a small stone house with a garden where she could grow her herbs. She accepted. She wrote to Bramwell, in the careful code they had agreed, that the mountain air suited her, and she would not be returning south, and she read between the lines of his reply that the king still lived, that the poison had not yet been used, that the spider was still spinning, and that her package sat safe in the marshal's keeping should she ever need to pull the thread. She was not idle in her exile. That was the thing her mother and Isolde never understood about her, because they had never bothered to look. Seraphine did not merely survive in Holdkeep. She studied it. She learned the guild towns the way Bramwell had taught her to read a ledger, following the money, mapping the power. She learned that the 4 passes that met at Holdkeep carried nearly all the trade between the northern kingdoms and the southern ones, that the guilds who controlled them were richer than half the alphas who thought themselves lords, and that their wealth rested on one fragile thing, the safety of the roads. She learned that the roads were not safe. Raiders worked the high passes, and worse than raiders, a rising warlord in the eastern range named Vextan Kor had begun to squeeze the guild caravans for tribute, and the guild councils were frightened and divided and slow. And she learned, listening in the healing room where frightened people say true things, that the warlord Vextan wasn't acting alone, that he had a patron in the south, someone feeding him coin and information, someone who wanted the northern trade routes strangled for reasons no one in Holdkeep could fathom. Seraphine could fathom them. She sat in her small stone house one night with a map spread before her, and she traced the trade routes, and the tribute, and the strangling of the passes, and she felt the old cold clarity settle over her like snow. Someone in the south wanted the north weakened. Someone in the south was using a warlord the way Isolde used her mother, as a tool, a fly who did not know he was caught. And she thought of Isolde's ambition, of a woman who wanted not merely a crown, but the fall of the old bloodlines. And she wondered whether the spider's web reached farther than a single throne. She did not yet have proof, but she had a question, and a question, she had learned, was the beginning of every diagnosis. The man who would become her ally arrived in Holdkeep on a broken axle and a foul temper in the second summer of Seraphine's exile. His name was Doran Vesk, and he was the master of the largest independent caravan company in the northern range, a lean, weathered man of middle years, with a scar through one eyebrow and the unhurried competence of someone who had survived things. He came to Seraphine's healing room because one of his drivers had taken a crossbow bolt through the shoulder in a raid on the eastern pass, and he stood in the corner with his arms folded while she worked, watching her hands, and when she had drawn the bolt and packed the wound and stitched it closed without the driver so much as fainting, Doran Vesk looked at her with the first real interest anyone in that town had shown in her mind, rather than her hands. "You did that like you've done it 100 times, he said. "I've done it more than that." "Palace trained," he said, and it was not a question. "Southern. Ashenmore, by the accent you're trying to lose." He smiled thinly at her stillness. "Don't worry, healer. I don't care what you're running from. Everyone in these towns is running from something. I care that you're the only person in Holdkeep who can put my drivers back together. and that you were looking at my caravan manifest on the table there, like you understood it." "I did understand it," Seraphine said. "You're paying tribute to Vexton Core on 3 of your 4 routes, and losing money on the 4th because you'd rather bleed than kneel. You won't last another year like that." The smile left his face. He pulled a stool from the wall and sat down across from her, and for the next 2 hours they talked, and it was the strangest and most exhilarating conversation of Seraphine's life, because, for the first time, she was speaking to someone as an equal about the thing she had been quietly studying alone. She told him what she had pieced together: the pattern of the tribute, the strangling of the passes, the southern patron behind the warlord. He listened the way Bramwell listened, without dismissal, and when she finished he was quiet a long time. "I've felt it," he said at last. "The pattern. Couldn't name it. Vexton's too well supplied for a mountain thug. Someone's arming him. I always assumed a rival guild. But you're saying it's someone in the south, someone playing a longer game." He rubbed the scar through his eyebrow. "Why? What does the south gain by choking the northern roads?" "Chaos," Seraphine said. "A weakened north. Trade routes that can be seized cheaply once the guilds are broken. And leverage. Whoever controls the passes controls the wealth of 4 kingdoms." She thought of Isolde again, of the reach of a truly patient ambition, and perhaps something more personal that I can't see yet. They became partners that summer, though neither of them called it that at first. Doran needed a mind that could see the whole board, and Seraphine needed a means to act, resources, riders, a reach beyond her healing room. He began to route his most sensitive information through her, the manifests and the tribute demands, and the whispered reports from his drivers, and she read them all and built her map larger and larger, and slowly the shape of the thing emerged from the fog. Vexton Core was being supplied through a single southern broker, a merchant house that moved coin and weapons north under false manifests, and the merchant house, when Seraphine finally traced its ownership through 3 shells and a forged charter, belonged to a holding company registered in the name of a noblewoman of Ashenmoor, a woman styling herself, in the newest documents, as Lady Isolde of Duskwater. Duskwater, her mother's estate, the price of her mother's comfort. Seraphine sat with that document in her hands until the candle burned down. So it was all one web after all. Isolde had not been content to poison one king and seize one throne. She was choking the northern trade to bankrupt the guild towns, to break the free towns that answered to no alpha, so that when Ashenmoor owes beneath her, there would be no rival power left standing to oppose it. She was not merely a mistress grasping at a crown. She was building an empire, and she meant to raise it on the bones of everyone who had ever been in her way, including a dutiful daughter she had ordered killed and forgotten in a mountain snow. She should have felt fear. Instead, she felt the strange calm of a physician who has finally named the disease. You cannot fight a fever you cannot see. Now she could see it. Now she knew its shape, its source, its patient and murderous logic, and she understood, holding that forged charter to the candlelight, that she was no longer the weakest piece on the board. She was the only person in 2 kingdoms who could see the whole board at once. She did not move rashly. That had never been her way, and the mountains had only deepened her patience. Over the following months, she and Doran began, quietly, to turn the warlord's own strategy against the hand that fed him. If Vexton Core was supplied through a single southern broker, then the broker was a thread, and threads could be cut. Seraphine didn't have an army, But she had something better. She had information, and she had a merchant partner with contacts in every guild town on 4 passes, and she had a lifetime of watching how the powerful destroy each other when you let them. She began with the guild councils. She could not walk into their chambers as a foreign healer and be believed. She had learned that lesson in the palace, the lesson that truth without standing is only noise. So she built her standing first. She let Doran take her findings to the councils under his own name, a respected caravan master with 2 decades of trust, and she stood behind him as the healer who had merely noticed a pattern. Piece by piece, over the turning of a year, they laid the evidence before the fractious, frightened guild masters of Holdkeep and the 3 other pass towns, the false manifests, the shell companies, the single southern broker bleeding them all. And slowly, because the evidence was undeniable, and because their fear had finally found a target it could name, the councils began to move. They did what frightened merchants do best. They stopped paying. Not all at once, which would have brought Vextan's raiders down on them in fury, but selectively, strategically, in a pattern Seraphine designed to look like ordinary hardship rather than coordinated defiance. They shorted the tribute. They delayed the caravans on which the warlord depended. They quietly funded a company of pass wardens, mountain men who knew the high trails, to harry Vextan's supply lines the way his raiders had harried theirs. And all the while, Doran's riders carried word to the other northern kingdoms, to the trade cities beyond the range, that the choking of the passes had a name and a source, and that source was a merchant house flying a false Ashenmoor charter. Vextan Core began to starve. A warlord is only as strong as his supply, and his supply had always come from the south, from the patient hand of the woman at Duskwater. As the guild towns tightened and the pass wardens bled him and his tribute dried up, he did what desperate men do. He demanded more from his patron. He sent riders south with threats and pleas, and Seraphine, who had spies of her own now in the caravan trains, read copies of every message before they crossed the mountains, and she smiled her cold healer's smile, because a tool that turns on its maker is the most beautiful thing in any physician's arsenal. It was in the 3rd winter of her exile that the first crack appeared in the south, and it came, as such things do, through Bramwell. The old man's letters had grown thinner over the years, his hand shakier, but he still wrote, and he still watched, and one grey letter arrived by a half-frozen courier, bearing news that made Seraphine sit very still for a long time. The king was ill. Caelthorn, the Alpha King of Ashenmoor, had fallen into a slow and wasting sickness that no healer could name, a softening of the mind and the will. And the court whispered that the Mistress Isolde had taken the reins of governance into her own hands while the king faded. The council vote she had wanted for years was to be held at last, the marriage decree that would name her Queen Regent, and there was no one left in the palace with the standing or the courage to oppose her. So she had used the poison after all, not through Maren, or perhaps through Maren too, but she had found her vessel and filled the king's cup, and now the slow tincture was doing exactly what Seraphine had known it would do all those years ago, softening a strong man's mind to wax, and the proof of it, the sealed vial and the account in Seraphine's own hand, still sat in the War Marshal Corvain's keeping in the south, waiting, forgotten by everyone but the woman who had planted it and the old man who guarded it. Seraphine read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and set it down and looked into the fire, and she understood that the long game had reached the board's edge, that the 2 halves of the web, the throne in the south and the strangled passes in the north were about to be pulled tight by the same hand, and that she was the only person alive who held both ends of the thread. She could have gone to Corvain then. She could have sent word to pull the vial from its keeping and lay the poison plot before the Marshal and let Ashenmoor tear itself apart. But she had learned patience in the mountains, and she had learned something harder than patience. She had learned that to break a spider, you must break the whole web at once, or the creature simply spins a new one. If she exposed the poison alone, Isolde would deny it, and the vial would become one accusation against a woman who now held the throne in all but name. If she exposed the northern conspiracy alone, the guilds would break Vexton Core, and the southern patron would slip back into the shadows and wait. She had to bring both ends together, the poisoning of the king and the strangling of the passes, and she had to place them in the one hand that could act on both. And that hand, she realized, was not the Marshal's after all. It was the king's, if the king could be brought back to his own mind, which meant she had to save Calethorn, the man her mother had agreed to poison, the man on whose shoulders she had once ridden as a child. She had to reach into the poisoned heart of the palace she had fled and pull the king back from the wax, and to do it she would have to walk back into the one place in the world where her death had already been decided. She told Doran her plan on a night when the snow fell so thick it muffled the whole town to silence. He listened, as he always did, and when she finished he was quiet. And then he said the thing she hadn't let herself hope anyone would say. "You're not going alone. It's my reckoning," she said, "not yours. It stopped being only yours the day you traced that charter to Duskwater," he said. "The woman who's strangling my passes and the woman who poisoned your king are the same woman. You want to break her web in one stroke. Fine, but you'll need riders you trust, and a way into a palace that will kill you on sight, and a reason for the guild councils to send you south as more than a runaway healer. I can give you all three." He leaned forward. "Let the guild send you as an envoy, Seraphine. Not a fugitive, an official envoy of the 4 free towns, come to lay before the Alpha King the proof that his own court has been supplying the warlord who chokes the northern trade. That's a diplomatic mission. That's a person no one can simply murder in a corridor. And it puts you in the throne room, standing before the king, with the law of 2 lands at your back." She stared at him, and she felt the last piece of the plan click into place, like a bolt sliding home. And she understood that this was what an ally was. This was the thing she had never had. Someone who took her cold clarity and made it sharper still. They spent the rest of that winter preparing. The guild councils, when Doran and Seraphine laid the full case before them, the false charter, the southern patron, the strangling of their own lifeblood, voted almost without dissent to send an envoy south to confront the court of Ashenmoor. And they chose, at Doran's urging, and to Seraphine's quiet satisfaction, the healer who had first seen the pattern, the woman who knew the palace and the poison and the players better than anyone alive. She would go with the full weight of the 4 free towns behind her, with a sealed commission and a company of Doran's hardest riders, and she would go not as Seraphine, the discarded daughter, but as envoy Seraphine of Hold Keep, and no one in that palace would know the 2 were the same woman until she chose to tell them. She rode south as the passes cleared, 3 years and a lifetime after she had ridden north. She wore the deep forest green of the mountain guilds now, and she carried herself with the unhurried authority of a woman who had built something with her own hands. When she crossed the second range and came down into the terraced valley of Ashenmoor, she looked at the palace on its height, small and grey in the distance, and she felt nothing of the child who had fled it. She felt only the cold clarity, and beneath it, banked like a coal, something she did not name, but which had been burning quietly for 3 years. Word of the northern envoy reached the palace before she did, as she had intended. An official mission from the free towns could not be turned away at the gate, not without an insult that would harden 4 kingdoms against Ashenmoor at the worst possible moment. And so the woman who had been marked for death was received, with cold ceremony, into the very heart of the court that had condemned her. She rode through the northern gate she had fled through, past the tapestries of the Ashenmoor kings, and the mounted antlers and the smoking sconces, and she was shown to a chamber and told that the court would receive her petition in 3 days, when the full moon rose, and the council convened for the vote that would make Isolde Queen Regent. 3 days. She had timed her arrival to the hour. She did not waste them. On the first night she found Bramwell, older and frailer than his letters had let her imagine, bent nearly double now over his ledgers in the cold archive, and when he looked up and saw her, the envoy in her mountain green, his eyes filled, and he pressed his shaking hand to his mouth. "Child," he whispered, "you came back. I never thought you'd be fool enough to come back." "I came back to finish it," she said, and she knelt beside his chair and took his hands, and she told him the whole of it, the northern web and the poison thread, and the trap she meant to spring in the throne room in 3 days' time. And Bramwell listened and wept, and then, being who he was, he stopped weeping and began to help. The vial and the account she had left with the Marshal Corvain 3 years before were still sealed in his keeping, the old steward confirmed, because Corvain was a soldier of the old school who did not throw away a thing given into his trust, even a thing he had half forgotten. And the Marshal, Bramwell said, had grown quietly sick with unease, as the king faded and the mistress rose, sick enough that he might, if approached rightly, be ready to act. "Then approach him," Seraphine said. "Tell him the northern envoy carries proof that will clear his conscience and his king. Tell him to bring what he holds in trust to the throne room on the night of the vote, and tell him one thing more so he knows to trust me." She leaned close and whispered the last, the thing only Corvain and one other would understand, the detail that would prove she was who she claimed. Bramwell nodded and went, on his ruined old knees, to do the last great service of his life. On the second night, she saw her mother. She had not sought it. She had meant to keep clear of Maren until the trap was sprung, to let no flicker of recognition warn the web that its breaker had come home. But the palace is a small world of shared corridors, and on the second night, turning a corner near the healing rooms she had once worked in, Seraphine came face to face with the woman who had borne her and sold her, and there was no avoiding it. Maren was older, greyer, thinner, worn down by 3 years of the thing she had chosen, and she looked at the envoy in green with a servant's automatic deference and no recognition at all. For a moment, and then something in the shape of Seraphine's stillness, the particular way she held her head, reached through 3 years, and the change of clothes and the mountain weathering, and Maren's face went white as bone. "Seraphine," she breathed. "Envoy Seraphine," she corrected, gently, and watched her mother understand. They stood in the cold corridor, and Seraphine looked at the woman she had grieved while she still lived, and she found that the grief had finished. There was no more of it left to feel. There was only a great and level quiet, the quiet of a debt fully accounted. "You have to go," Maren whispered, and to Seraphine's surprise there was terror in it, and the terror was for her. "You have to go tonight, before the vote, before she sees you. If Isolde knows you're here, if she knows you're alive and you've come back, she'll kill you. She'll find a way. I couldn't stop her. I could never stop her." "You never tried to stop her," Seraphine said. "Not cruelly. Just true. You agreed. The price of your comfort. I heard you, Mother. 3 years ago, through the chapel door. I heard every word." Marin's face crumpled. "I was afraid," she said. "She had me. She had me from the first year we came here. She knew a thing about your father's death. A thing I did. A thing I was afraid. And I told myself she'd never really make me do it. I told myself I'd find a way. And then the years went by, and I was in so deep I couldn't see the top of it anymore." She reached out, and Seraphine did not step back and did not lean in. "I never gave her the poison. That's the truth, whatever else I've done. I couldn't. She found another way, another hand. But it wasn't mine. It was never mine. That's all I have to give you. It's not enough. I know it's not enough." Seraphine looked at her a long moment. "No," she said. "It isn't." And then, because she was not her mother, and not Isolde, and not made of the thing they were made of, she added, "But it isn't nothing, either. Stay clear of the throne room tomorrow night, Mother. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, stay clear of it. That's the only mercy I have to give you, and I'm giving it because you tried, at the last, to send me away safe. Take it and be gone." And she left her mother weeping in the corridor and went to prepare for the last move of the game. The council convened on the night of the full moon in the great throne hall of Ashenmoor, beneath the mounted antlers and the banners of the old bloodlines, and the hall was full. The lords of the court were there, grave and uneasy. The War Marshal Corvain stood at the side in his old campaign grey, a wooden box held in his scarred hands, and a strange fixed look on his weathered face. And on the throne sat Caelthorn, the Alpha King, and the sight of him stopped Seraphine's breath, because he was a ruin of the man who had lifted her onto his shoulders. He sat slack and grey, his eyes half-focused, his great frame diminished, the poison's long work laid plain on him for anyone with a healer's eye to read. And beside the throne, standing where a consort stands, radiant in white and gold with the confidence of a woman 1 vote from a crown, was Isolde. Seraphine was announced as the envoy of the free towns, and she walked the long length of the hall in her forest green, and she felt every eye upon her, and she kept her face still. Isolde watched her come with the polite contempt of the powerful for the petitioner, and there was not the faintest flicker of recognition in it, because Isolde had never once truly looked at the healer's daughter she had ordered killed, and so she did not know her now. The free towns of the Varan Range send greetings to the court of Ashenmoor, Seraphine said, and her voice carried clear and level to the rafters. And they send a petition and a warning and a gift of truth that this court has been too long denied. The free towns, Isolde said smoothly, before the king could gather himself to speak, may state their petition briefly. His Majesty tires. She let the word settle, established for the whole hall who spoke for the throne now. What does a rabble of merchants want from Ashenmoor? They want to know, Seraphine said, why a noblewoman of this court has spent 3 years arming the warlord Vexton Corps, choking the northern passes, and bleeding the free towns toward ruin through a merchant house, flying a forged Ashenmoor charter. She let that land in the sudden dead silence of the hall. They want to know why the mistress who stands at the foot of this throne registered that merchant house in the name of Lady Isolde of Duskwater, and paid the warlord's tribute from the estate she was granted 3 years ago as the price of a promise. The hall erupted. Isolde's composed face did not so much as twitch, but Seraphine, who had learned to read the small signs, saw the flicker deep in her eyes, the spider feeling the first tremor in a thread it had thought secure. "Lies," Isolde said, cutting through the noise. "The desperate slander of failing merchants looking for a foreign devil to blame for their own weakness. There is no charter. There is no proof." "There is proof," Seraphine said. "It is here. Manifests, ledgers, the chain of ownership through 3 shell companies to the holding registered at Duskwater, and the sworn testimony of the brokers who moved your coin and weapons north. The 4 free towns have sealed copies in 4 separate keepings. Burn what I carry tonight, and you change nothing." She turned, slowly, to the war marshal at the side of the hall. "But that is not the whole of the gift I bring this court. That is only the northern half of it. Marshal Corvain, you hold something in trust, something given to you 3 years ago, with instructions to open it only if a certain person vanished or died. That person did neither. That person stands before you now. Open the box." Corvain stepped forward. His hands were not quite steady, but his voice was a soldier's, flat and carrying. "3 years ago," he said, "a package was left in my keeping by the palace steward's man, old Bramwell. I was told to bring it before the crown, and only the crown, should the healer Seraphine, junior to the royal healer, ever disappear or die on the northern road. I did not know what became of her. I confess I near forgot the thing. But an envoy sent me a word 2 nights past, a word only that vanished healer could have known, the name my king gave his first sword, that I have told no living soul." He looked at Seraphine, and something in his old face broke open. "You are Seraphine, the widow Marin's girl. You never went missing at all. You went north and made yourself an envoy and came home to spring a trap." He turned to the throne, and he opened the wooden box, and he lifted from it a small, wax-sealed vial, and a folded account gone yellow with 3 years waiting. "Then by the terms of the trust, I bring this before the crown." "Read it," Seraphine said. "Read it aloud, Marshal, so the whole court hears it in the hand of the woman who wrote it 3 years ago." And Corvain read. He read Seraphine's careful account of the wolfsbane tincture distilled through moonflower, of what it was and what it did, a slow softening of the mind and will that in the wrong dose stopped the heart. He read the description of the sealed vial, and how it had been drawn from a full bottle kept in the cedar box of the royal healer. And he read the account of the plot Seraphine had overheard through the chapel door on a cold night 3 years gone. The plot to poison the Alpha King into a soft-minded ruin so that he would sign a marriage decree and name his mistress queen, and to murder the healer's daughter, who was the last inconvenient thread. He read the name of the woman who had spoken those words. He read the name Isolde. The silence when he finished was the silence of a held breath before a fall. And then Kylethorn stirred on his throne. Slow, ruined, half lost in the fog of 3 years' poison, the king lifted his heavy head and turned it toward the woman in white and gold beside him, and something surfaced in his clouded eyes, some last cinder of the mind that had ruled 4 provinces, some memory of a healer's girl he had once carried on his shoulders. "The cup," he said, and his voice was a wreck, but the whole hall heard it. "You brought me the cup, every night, your own hand. 3 years, and I grew weak, and I could not think, and you brought me the cup and told me it was medicine." His great grey head trembled. "It was medicine. That's what she said. Isolde, she said it was medicine." "Your Majesty is unwell," Isolde said. and for the first time a fracture showed in the smooth surface of her voice, a hairline crack running fast. He is confused. He does not know what he says. This envoy is an impostor, a fugitive, a madwoman with a grudge, and she has poisoned the marshal's mind with a forged. The vial can be tested, Seraphine said, calm against the rising edge of Isolde's fury, calm the way she had learned to be calm at the bedside of the dying. Any healer in this hall can test it, and the king's own body is the proof. Look at him. You have all looked at him for 3 years and told yourselves it was age, or grief, or the weight of the crown. It is wolfsbane and moonflower, administered slow, and I could bring him back from the edge of it in a month, if this court gives me leave. That is the difference, Lady Isolde, between the healer's daughter you ordered killed and the woman you married your ambition to. I spent 3 years learning to save lives. You spent them learning to take them at a distance, cleanly, so your own hands would stay white. She took a step closer to the throne, and now, at last, she let Isolde see it, the recognition, the whole of it. You never once looked at me. In 17 years in this palace, you never once looked at the healer's quiet daughter, because you did not think me worth the glance. That was your single greatest mistake. I heard every word you spoke through that chapel door. I have spent 3 years pulling every thread of your web, and I came home tonight not to accuse you, but to end you. Isolde's composure broke then, all at once, the way a frozen river breaks, and the fury that came pouring through was the truest thing she had shown the hall all night. "You think a box of old paper unmakes me?" she hissed. "You think these frightened lords will move against the woman who has held this kingdom together while their king drooled on his throne? I built this, every stone of it. I earned—" "You bought it," Seraphine said, "with poison and forged charters and a warlord's blood money and a mother's fear. You built the gallows, Isolde. I only bought the lumber back, and now I've handed the court the rope." She turned from the mistress to the assembled lords, to the war-marshal with the vial in his hand, to the guild seals and the sworn testimonies her riders were already laying on the long table. The free towns have their proof of the northern conspiracy. The crown has its proof of the poisoning. Both lead to the same hand. The vial can be tested tonight, the charter can be traced by morning, and the warlord Vextan Kor, starved of his southern coin these 3 years by the free towns, has already turned on the patron who abandoned him. His riders carry word south even now, naming the merchant house at Duskwater. There is no thread left for you to pull, my lady. I have pulled them all. It did not end in a single stroke, because true reckonings rarely do. It ended in the slow, grinding, undeniable way that real power falls. Marshal Corvain, his conscience unbound at last, called his soldiers to hold the hall. The lords, freed by the proof from 3 years of fear, found their courage all at once, as frightened men do, and turned on the woman who had ruled them through a poisoned king. The vial was tested before the night was out, and it was what Seraphine had said it was, and the king's slow ruin had a name at last. And Isolde, radiant no longer, was taken from the throne hall of Ashenmoor, not as a queen regent, but as a poisoner and a traitor, and the white and gold she had worn to her crowning became the clothes she was arrested in. Seraphine did not watch them take her. She had learned, in 3 years of mending broken bodies, that there is no satisfaction to be found in another person's ruin, only the grim relief of a wound finally cleaned. She turned instead to the king, to Caelthorn slumped and shaking on his throne, and she went to him, as a healer goes to a patient, and she took his great grey hand in her small scarred one, and she said, "I can bring you back, your majesty. It will take a month, and it will be hard, and your mind will fight its way up out of the fog by inches. But I can bring you back, if you'll let me." And the ruined king looked at the healer's daughter he had once carried on his shoulders, and his clouded eyes cleared for a moment with something that might have been shame and might have been hope, and he closed his shaking fingers around her hand, and he said, "I never looked either. God forgive me. You served in my house for 17 years, and I never once looked at you as anything but the widow's quiet girl. And you're the one who came back to save my life." He drew a slow, wrecked breath. "Bring me back, Seraphine, and then help me set right what was done in my name." She stayed the month, and then longer. She brought Kelthorne back from the edge of the poison by inches, exactly as she had promised, and as his mind cleared, he proved to be, beneath the ruin, the grave and decent man she half remembered from her childhood, a king who had been blind but was not cruel, who had been deceived but was not himself a deceiver. And as he recovered his strength, he did the thing he had promised. He set right what had been done in his name. The forged charter was traced, and the merchant house at Duskwater seized. The warlord Vexton Core, cut off from every source of coin and hunted now by both the free towns in the north and the crown in the south, was broken within the year, his raiders scattered, the four passes opened to trade for the first time in a decade. And the free towns of the Varren Range, who had sent a healer south as an envoy, found that their envoy had not merely cleared their name, but forged an alliance, a lasting peace, and a trade compact between the crown of Ashenmore and the free towns of the north, sealed by the woman who belonged, now, to both worlds. As for Isolde, she was tried before the full council of the realm, and the proof against her was a mountain no defense could climb. The vial and the charter and the sworn testimonies and the broken warlord's own bitter confession, laid out with the patient thoroughness of a physician's diagnosis. She was stripped of the estate and the title she had bought with poison, stripped of the beauty of her standing, stripped of everything external that had ever given her power. For she had never possessed a single source of strength that was truly her own. She had been the hollow figure all along, the decorative and vicious replacement for every loyal thing she had discarded, and when the external power was pulled away, there was nothing underneath to hold her up. She left the great hall of Ashenmore in disgrace, exiled to the cold northern estates she had once tried to strangle, to live out her years watching the free trade she had failed to break flow richly past her window. Seraphine did not gloat. She did not attend the sentencing. She sent, in fact, one small mercy, an instruction that the disgraced woman was to be given decent quarters and enough to live on, not out of forgiveness, but because a physician does not leave even an enemy to die in a ditch, and because mercy from a position of total victory is the sharpest dominance of all, and both women knew it. Maren she saw only once more. Her mother came to her before she left the palace, thin and grey, and hollowed out by 3 years of the thing she had chosen, and she did not ask for forgiveness, which was the only wise thing she had done in a decade. "I won't ask you for anything," Maren said. "I gave up the right to ask you for anything the night I agreed to her bargain. I only wanted to see, before you go, what you made of yourself, what you became when you got away from us." She looked at her daughter, the envoy, the healer who had brought a king back from death and broken a spider's web across 2 kingdoms. "You became everything I was too frightened to be. That's the thing I'll carry, not the guilt. The guilt is mine and I'll keep it. But that too, that my daughter became the brave thing I never was." Seraphine looked at her mother a long time. She did not offer an embrace, and Maren did not reach for one. And there was a strange clean honesty in the distance between them, the honesty of 2 people who finally see each other plainly. "I don't hate you," Seraphine said at last, and found it was true. I did, for a while, on the road north. I don't anymore. You were a fly in her web, and you let yourself be caught, and you sold me to stay comfortable, and all of that is true, and none of it can be undone. But you tried, at the end, to send me away safe. So I won't hate you. I just won't be your daughter anymore. That price was paid 3 years ago in the chapel, when I heard what I was worth to you. You can keep the guilt, Mother. I'll keep the life I built without you. And she left her mother standing in the corridor, and this time neither of them wept, and it was, in its cold way, a kind of peace. She did not stay in Ashenmore to become a lady of the court, though the grateful king would have made her one. That world had never been hers, and she had learned in the mountains where she truly belonged. She went home to Holdkeep, to the small stone house on the 3rd tier with the herb garden, to the healing room where her worth was measured by what her hands could do, and not by whose blood she carried or whose price she was. Doran Vesk was waiting for her at the town gate when she rode in, the caravan master with the scar through his eyebrow, and he looked at her a long moment and said only, "Well, you broke her web in one stroke, envoy. I never doubted you would." And the thing that had been banked between them like a coal for 3 years finally kindled into open flame, and it was not the desperate, status-hungry thing that Isolde had chased her whole life, but the quiet, equal partnership of 2 people who respected each other's minds before they ever loved each other's hearts. And it was, Seraphine thought, exactly the thing she had deserved all along, and had almost died, believing she would never have. She lived a long life in the free towns, and she never forgot the lesson the chapel door had taught her, the lesson she had carried north through the snow and back south into the throne room and home again to the mountains. Her worth had never been Isolde's to price, or her mother's to sell, or the palace's to grant. It had been hers all along, buried beneath 17 years of being told she was quiet and dutiful and useful and small. The betrayal had not destroyed her. It had, in the end, been the thing that set her free. Because a person who is loved and safe rarely learns what she is truly made of, and a person who is discarded into the snow either dies there or discovers that she was never as fragile as the people who threw her away believed. She had discovered it. She had built a life and a name and a peace between 2 kingdoms out of nothing but her own 2 hands and the cold clarity of a single night's grief. And that, she came to understand, was the only kind of power worth having, the kind that cannot be granted because it cannot be taken away. If this story moved you, if you felt the cold of that chapel corridor and the slow, warm triumph of Seraphine's return, then take a moment before you go. Give this video a like, because it helps stories like this one reach the people who need them. Share it with someone in your life who has ever been made to feel small by the very people who should have protected them. Someone who needs the reminder that being underestimated is not the same as being weak, and that the ones who throw us away rarely understand what they have lost until it is far too late. Subscribe to join a community that celebrates exactly this, the slow, patient, hard-won triumph of the people the world was foolish enough to discard. And tell me in the comments, if you had stood at that chapel door and heard those words, would you have screamed, or would you have walked away quietly and begun, like Seraphine, to build the reckoning that no one saw coming? I read every answer, and I want to hear yours.